This is a brilliant move by Landbridge.
Definitely will not be good for Australia its own.
The challenge for the Australian government to overcome that good faith hurdle is going to be these 3 previous security reviews.
I don't think that is a very common or good thing for Australia, just to copy what the United States is doing.
Should this case go the wrong way for Australia, it will raise question marks in the eyes of many other investors.
I think it just sends a bad signal to China. It sends a bad signal to Australia. It's not going to help investment in either place and worldwide.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tian. Joining me to discuss the Chinese company Landmark Group's legal battle against the Australian government to prevent the forced termination of its lease of the Darwin Port, Dr. Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor, Queensland University of Technology, Australia, Dr. Zhou Mi, Deputy Director, Institute of American and Oceania Study, Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Dr. Edward Lehman, the founder and managing director of the China-based law firm Lehman, Lee and Shi. Welcome back to the chat, gentlemen. Let's first take a brief look at the background of Landbridge's latest move. Back in January, the Australian government signaled it could reclaim the 99-year lease of Darwin Port, currently operated by the Chinese company. Then, about 2 weeks ago, Landbridge filed for international arbitration with the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, which is affiliated with the World Bank. And it argues that Australia has breached the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Let's begin with our Chinese guest here, Zhou Mi. From a Chinese perspective, did that move surprise you?
I don't think it's surprising because, under the framework of the free trade agreements between our two countries, we have a dispute settlement mechanism. And if any enterprises who are feeling that there's something wrong with promises from each side, from the government, maybe they can use these channels to try to protect their benefits. So as I was also involved in the negotiation of the free trade agreement between China and Australia almost 20 years ago. So I was there when we talked about the protections for the enterprises, especially for the investors. We guaranteed that both governments are able or should be able to provide transparent information to the enterprises and also to give them enough channels to try to deal with some of these uncertainties. So for the almost 10 years after the free trade agreement took into effect, I think that most of these promises about the trading goods and trading services are already met by both sides. But if the companies found that there is something wrong with the promises, they are able to use the mechanism to deal with these problems. So according to this kind of mechanism design, I would say that is not surprising at all, especially when the enterprises are feeling in a very weak position compared with the government side, government power of Australia. They can try to use the mechanism to protect their benefits.
But Landbridge acted actually before negotiations had fully broken down. Has that surprised you to any extent? Not at all?
I just wanted to add,
all right,
if I might, just as far as, how this is from a legal and tactical perspective, it's a rules-based counterattack. It's not just a rhetorical flourish as far as when the filing took place. So I just say from a legal perspective. So what Landbridge has done is they filed under the ICSID, that International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, as you said, which was established under the World Bank. It's created back in 1965, and there's 160 state signatories, including Australia. So this is the most credible and most institutionally legitimate forum, for Landbridge to file under. And it was signed, Australia, like I said, has signed the convention and negotiated the CHAFTA provisions, and it's now being called into account under that framework that it voluntarily created. So tactically speaking, what Landbridge has done is they've filed before the divestiture could come into play. There was, they were banging the drum back in 2020, back in 2021 or 2023 with, in Canterbury as far as trying to do something about this. And so, I think that this was a brilliant move by Landbridge to file it before the issuance of the formal divestment order by Australia. And it's kind of a preemptive legal strike that accomplishes three things. At first, it puts the Australian government on notice and are now being conducted under the watchful eye of an international tribunal. The second thing is it creates an undeniable record that Landbridge sought in good faith dialogue to trying to restore by a legal action. And then third, it creates an implicit leverage against the unilateral coercive action of mid-arbitration where they're trying to divest it. So they kind of blocked them is the short answer.
Then Australia, from an Australian perspective, Warwick, would you see it as a calculated pressure tactic or more of a defensive response or preemptive legal strike like Ed just mentioned?
As Ed mentioned, I think it was a strategically very good move for all the reasons that Ed mentioned. I think one of the challenges from Australia's point of view is that the lease provided or agreed to be given to Landbridge in 2015 was done so through an open competitive process where questions of national security were considered, and there have been subsequent reviews since, all of which have concluded that there were no national security risks to be concerned about. And this does create some problems because the move announced prior to the last federal election appears to be explicitly politically motivated with very, very little ground. Part of the problem for the federal government is that its own reviews and the reviews undertaken by Defence concluded that there were no issues. And so when it announced its intentions to bring the port's operational rights back into Australian hands, it then had to explain precisely why it needed to do that, given that the port's operations had been turned around, that the leaseholder had made substantial investments and actually made the port profitable, and ultimately has left a legacy for that port of infrastructure that enables it to function at a higher level. And I think that this move puts the spotlight on these issues as well, because when the issue of national security gets raised, it's one thing to talk about national security as political rhetoric. It's a very different thing to demonstrate it to legal satisfaction. What precisely is involved? What are the issues and why those issues actually constitute national security risks? And that's not going to be easy to do.
Right. Then some people would call it some escalation. Do you agree?
From Landbridge's side?
Yes.
Well, look, escalation, de-escalation, I think often are a little bit overused as ideas, and I guess we tend to use them a bit because these issues get framed in terms of contests and war and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of a company seeking to protect its own rights, you wouldn't call it escalation. You would literally call it a very intelligent, rights-protecting move. Okay. Now, what it also does, though, is that because everyone knows that this particular tribunal doesn't bring down a decision in a week, this is going to create a process that will take some years. And the passage of time also creates opportunities for the arrival at a mutually acceptable solution. So in some ways, it has compelled the Australian government to address it at this level rather than reach for the heavy hammer of compulsory acquisition.
Like you mentioned, you can call it meaningful for Australia because this could become Australia's first major investor-state dispute case. Then what kind of symbolic weight does it carry for Australia?
It depends on how this unfolds, of course, and how the final result unfolds. But again, puts a country like Australia, which seeks to be, broadly speaking, open to foreign investment. And for that to happen, you need to provide a safe and secure and predictable legal environment for investors. The concern is that should this case go the wrong way for Australia, it will raise question marks in the eyes of many other investors as to whether or prospective investors as to whether or not they will expose themselves to what is in effect, so the argument runs, a capricious decision by the Australian government.
We'll dive deeper into that or the implications later on. But let's go back a little bit to the beginning. When Landbridge secured this 99-year lease in 2015, the deal was widely seen as legitimate, even routine. Then what has changed? Maybe our legal expert here?
Yeah, I think that Darwin, I didn't realize this, but I mean, it was bombed 200 times by the Japanese during World War II. I guess historically speaking, it's something that means something historically to that region as far as the port is concerned. So, I mean, we don't want to go too far back with that, but I'm saying that the countries looked at it that way. I mean, what's ironic with this whole thing from a legal perspective was that on the domestic front, Australian politics, I mean, Labor is the governing party and it's officially opposed these provisions in the new trade agreements. And now it's kind of bouncing back because they initially, sort of flip-flopped as to what it is. So I think that's a bit embarrassing, I would imagine. Other folks can chime in on what that is. But from a legal perspective, I think that Landbridge has good grounds. And like was pointed out, this is not going to get solved within a week. But I think what it indicates is kind of a chilling effect on Chinese investment globally, which it just shows that if people are going to change direction the way that they are, I mean, look at what happened with the Panama Canal, and now it's happening here. And I think that it's obviously, going to continue to damage the Australia-China relationship. So from a legal perspective, it shows that the government isn't going to stand by, contractual obligation that they had. I mean, the out is always national security, public security, something like that, which is a clause that most governments have to basically abridge or end contracts like that. And that's essentially what's happening in this particular case, because this has been going on since 2015, I guess, since the negotiations were going through. So this has been kicking around for some time, and it's finally rearing its head.
There is an interesting part in this, Ed, and that is in 2015. So the process of the lease was run by the territory government, not the federal government, because the port is actually owned by the territory government. But FIRB, the Foreign Investment Review Board, and other provisions under things like the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act came into force as part of the process. And there were no objections from the federal government either, notwithstanding the Obama administration actually expressing quite a lot of displeasure. So at that point in time, the federal government didn't see this as warranting any particular concerns from a national security point of view. Now, the Obama administration was concerned in large part because the Port of Darwin is near to military basing facilities that the United States uses as part of its troop rotations through Northern Australia. I guess the argument at that point in time was that Chinese ownership of the port, or having the long-term lease of the port, could give rise to assorted security risks, whether they were espionage or sabotage or control over access to the port or what have you. And I think that this is where this case is going to end up turning on, is ultimately what does constitute issues of national security? What are they? There is no checklist. I mean, we hear often the use of concepts like the national interest, for example. But of course, what constitutes the national interest is something that's quite amorphous. And I think part of the challenge here now is that it will force the Commonwealth of Australia to define precisely what it means by national security. And the minute it starts to do that, it opens up real questions around risk assessment as well as potential mitigations. Because if there are reasonable mitigations for potential risks, however defined they are, then the question of excessiveness, I guess, comes to the table. So, the response to deal with these risks rather than through regulations or additional operational conditions or what have you, instead of doing it that way, to now say, well, we're going to take it off you, could be argued to be an excessive reaction. So, I think that there's from a legal point of view, but also from a political point of view and an economic point of view, there's a lot of interesting things that cases like this will flush out.
You said Australia will have to define what constitutes national security. You mean currently there is no clear definition of that in Australia? When do you expect that to begin, or this kind of process?
Well, in a sense, what constitutes national security is a case-by-case problem, right? But there are certain categories of things that could go towards this issue of security. But just as much as you can raise concerns about these issues, because they are risks, the possibilities of certain things happening, there are also mitigations to those risks, things that can be done to reduce the probability of these adverse things from happening. And I think that the Australian government's defence is going to revolve heavily around this question of national security, whereas the Landbridge case, of course, revolves around the breach of clauses within CHAFTA concerning fair dealings, discrimination, etc., etc. So if the Australian side is going to argue the case, then they are going to need to explain why national security is at stake and why compulsory reacquisition or some kind of an acquisition, taking back control, is the only reasonable and necessary response. And I think that there are going to be some hurdles to explain all of that.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
And then back to Landbridge's side. Zhou Mi, Landbridge is invoking the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and it's our arbitration claim. You said you were present or one of the representatives, right, when this trade agreement was drafted. So which provisions could be decisive for Landbridge legal action?
I want to also add some of my understanding about the so-called national security. We know that national security is kind of a very sensitive word and widely used by different governments or different countries. And I think that maybe some people are really want to try to copy the others' experiences, like from the United States for the CFIUS. So actually, when we are talking about the FIRB of Australia, there are a lot of similarities between these two areas, two countries' practices on the national security. So I don't think that is a very common or good thing for Australia just to copy what the United States is doing, because both countries are having a quite different stage of development, and our trading partners are quite different. So in my understanding that if you are Australia is just trying to use the United States as a standard to copy its practices on national security, it definitely will not be good for Australia its own. Like for this example, the Darwin Port, I think that most of these worries are from the United States side, from the military bases. But for Australia side, they want to have a better and stronger trade relations with trading partners if the port is able to facilitate this kind of improvement. I think that people are benefiting from that, and also the economies are benefiting from that. And it will be more secured compared with the past. If the companies are not able to provide infrastructure or facilitation on the trade, I think that many supply chains will diverge from these areas, and the people are suffering from that. There will be more national security problems. So let me return to that question you asked me. I would say that in the free trade agreement, normally there will be several chapters. And for this case, I would say there were maybe two places we can try to find some solution or support. The first is that in the chapter of the trading services, and the acquiring or the renting of the Darwin Port is based on the service trade in the sector of logistics or transportation, maritime transportation. And also maybe they have some relations with custom clearance services or other services. For the chapter of the trading services, they do have this commitment by the Australia side. And if they are violating these promises, I think that maybe the company can try to use the mechanism to deal with that. And another chapter is about investment. The investment, Australia is using, in my understanding, is also using the negative list-based FBI management method. I don't remember that they have some kind of requirement for this investment put in the negative list. So I think the Chinese companies can also argue with Australian government on that. So for both chapters, we're quite clear, but I think that this chapter do have a separate chapter about the dispute settlement. And for some of these issues, maybe not managed in that chapter, but for other issues, it should be looked in details in this agreement, the context. But I'm sure that for both for the trading services and the investment, the companies can find some possible solution or channel to do some kind of argument for Australia government's behaviors.
Ed, what's your legal interpretation of this? Which legal provisions are likely to be decisive? Things like fair and equitable treatment or rules around expropriation and compensation. And what are the chances of success for Landbridge?
Something's going to happen. That's for sure. There would be compensation. If it's taken away from them, is my guess. One has to first look at the rules of the body itself, and then how the panel is formed, and then the evidence that's put in there, of course. And like it was pointed out earlier, they passed not one, not two, but three, security clearances before this thing went in place. There hasn't been much that has changed in between. The only thing that's changed is kind of the audience. The audience was Beijing. Then now it's sort of shifted to the United States. And as a result, some changes have been made. So there's essentially a contract in place for Landbridge. And if they decide to take that away from them, Australia's a place where they have common law, and they have this due process is demanded. They put it underneath, like I said, this particular tribunal, which is a smart thing. So this international tribunal, of which Australia signed off on, is a signatory to, as is China, as is the United States. So they will have to follow that rule, as opposed to leaving it be up to the Australian government and the due process within Australia. So I think, like I said, technically it was a good move. I think that whatever happens they're going to get either be successful or they're going to be compensated for it in one way or another. That's kind of the short answer.
Zhou Mi just mentioned how beneficial this has been or could be for Australia in the future. And Landbridge also highlights it has improved port operations, even turning losses into profits. But in a highly politicized dispute, how much weight does this kind of commercial argument really carry, Ed?
In my opinion, it really doesn't. And it even goes back to the American Civil War. I mean, Abraham Lincoln abridged people's rights, whether that was Robert E. Lee, whose home was in the North and his property was in the North, essentially. They had seized his property and said that, and that turned into Arlington Cemetery. I'm just giving like a very hyperbolic example of when a government decides that it's in the national interest, they go ahead and seize it. If you look at the Patriot Act in the United States under George W. Bush, they abridged all, and this is the idea with Edward Snowden. They were taking information and data, and they were saying it was in the national interest that the United States government would have it without due process, without notifying people. It happens. And so you see it happening time and time again in the United States, and it could happen here. That, and I don't want to use this word in particular, but that sort of trumps everything as far as a contract is concerned. Now, you have to make compensation to folks for that, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But yeah, I think that's the wild card that will mess this whole thing up. Now, it will take years to undo it, but it started, the fuse has started, and I think it makes a seismic shift in relations between countries for sure.
Then I think it's worth noting over the past decade, Darwin Port has undergone at least 3 security reviews, each finding no national security risk. And in 2023, authorities even concluded there was no need to alter or cancel the lease. How might those past findings influence the arbitration process this time?
Let me break that down. I think the idea of fairness, I think, is a very important one as a starting point, because when you break that question down, it goes to issues of good faith. Is this attempt to expropriate the port, political targeting, and this is a test that the Australian government's going to have to pass. It needs to demonstrate that it acted in good faith. The challenge for the Australian government to overcome that good faith hurdle is going to be these 3 previous security reviews. On the flip side, the government would need to marshal arguments that show that somewhere between 2023 and 2025 that the circumstances exogenous to this contract had changed so much that it warranted a bunch of new security issues. Even then, the question of good faith will arise, because if that was the concern, surely that should have been validated by another review. The second one, I think, is this issue of the nexus between the security interests. Can they demonstrate that there is actually, and that the proposed measures that they're taking are the appropriate ones, given whatever it is that the security concerns are, as articulated? Are they proportionate? And ultimately, are they non-discriminatory? Is it a set of actions that are actually taking place because of the nationality of the counterparty, or is it because of the security issues at stake? Now, those 2 things are going to be very hard to untangle, because national security ultimately involves defining a potential adversary, which means that the nationality of the counterparty is going to be part of this question, and that raises issues around discrimination. So I think fairness opens up this hornet's nest, or this Pandora's box of issues, which will put not only the issues on the table, but will put the Australian government in a position where it is going to have to do an exceptional job, given the fact that there is this history over the course of 10 years of reviews that have given this particular arrangement a clean bill of health. So the upside with this process, and this may be the face saver for everyone concerned, is that it gives time and it gives breathing room for some kind of a negotiated settlement ultimately to be arrived at that saves everyone's blushes. And by pushing it down this tribunal path before the Australian government could give effect to compulsory acquisition enables that to actually happen.
This has been the Chat Lounge. Beijing has already warned it would take measures to defend the company's interests if Australia proceeds with the forced termination of its lease of the Darwin Port. What kinds of responses can we realistically expect? That's coming up right after the break. Stay with us.
From the refreshing cup of tea that starts your morning, to the paper that you write on, the roots of many familiar parts of modern life can be traced back to ancient ideas.
2 crates of tea and dumped the whole thing straight into the ice. Rice even served as currency in 794. A new paper mill was founded in the Abbasid.
Across mountains, deserts, and oceans, these creations shaped the world then and continue to influence all of us today. Join us on Made in Ancient China and discover how ideas born millennia ago became some of the world's greatest treasures.
Welcome to Made in Ancient China. We hope you enjoyed this journey. May your thoughts...
Made in Ancient China brings you stories of human ambition, inspiration, and connection. Now available on all major podcast platforms.
Welcome back to Chat Lounge. We continue our chat on Chinese firm Landbridge's Darwin Port fight and the future of global investment rules. During this process, Landbridge is able to continue operating the port as usual, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what you just said makes a lot of sense, because also some analysts say this kind of legal action, given its multi-year proceeding, could serve as a buffer, actually, to provide some positive impacts for Sino-Australian relationship. But drawing from what you just mentioned, what do you expect to be the most likely outcomes of the arbitration then, Warwick?
My own sense is that the parties will arrive at a negotiated settlement before a determination is reached. And that's only because there's only upside for both parties if they can do that. One, of course, is financial compensation. And that's going to be a big question, because if I was Landbridge, I would be seeking significant damages based on future income losses. Okay, so that's a very significant issue. I'd also be seeking damages in relation to reputations, because the implication of this particular matter is that Landbridge is not a trustworthy company, which has obviously significant implications for Landbridge's standing as a global port operator. So the dollar figures involved will be quite substantial. But from the Australian government's point of view, if they can get that as an outcome, it could certainly be presented as a success, that the port and the operator of the port has been returned to Australian hands, and everybody in a sense can walk away. The Australian side will have to explain why they had to cough up so much money without actually winning the case, in effect conceding that their case wasn't as bulletproof as it was, and the Landbridge side will take the money.
Ed, is that what you expect too?
Yeah, certainly there's going to be money paid. I remember, like you said, it was a losing proposition. Now it's making money. I think that the EBITDA is something like $42 million, and it's growing at 25% annually, with 89 years of the lease remaining. So remember, they've been in just for 10 years now, and it generates a pretty large discounted cash flow at a present value. What the Australian government is probably doing is obviously looking for an Australian national company to acquire it, which might be the middle road here. The question is whether that's, and then have it be subsidized somehow by the Australian government to be able to cover. But this is a pretty big hole when you consider that they're selling at multiples of EBITDA, which is the profit that you're making. So that's a pretty big hole for somebody to cover. But, I think it's going to be, very messy to untangle. Like we said, it's not going to happen immediately, but Australia has to start to think now how to kind of get out of this without making everybody angry, or else going forward with it. By that, I'm saying not seize it. There's two legal points. One is actually seizure of that property, and the other one is a kind of a legal maneuver where you're not technically seizing it, but you're making it in essence not able to function. And so both of those are alternatives that could happen. They could also do something which would be highly unusual, but with the Australian national government saying that, and the Labor Party saying that they're not going to cooperate anyway, is go ahead with the divestment. I'm not saying that they're doing it, but just an option, and then sidestep it. A lot of countries have sidestepped international treaties, and there are repercussions on that type of action too. I don't anticipate that that's the case, but that would be an alternative on the table.
Warwick, do you expect that to happen?
Well, look, I think part of the challenge for the Australian government is that its political position domestically could be enhanced because it can play the national security or nationalism card. The downside risk is that it opens up the possibilities of broad reputational damage, of course, but also there's plenty of Australian businesses engaged in business in China who will, I think, be quite nervous about all of this, because if the Australian government wants to run a case on national security, even after 3 reviews determined that there was no national security issues. What's to say from an Australian business's point of view that they could get caught up in all sorts of other national security questions? And that's a very unpleasant thought for businesses involved in cross-border transactions. So I actually don't think that there's a lot of upside for the Australian government other than at a domestic electorate level to an extent. Now, probably the greatest upside is that it can demonstrate to the United States that it has, in the end, acceded to Obama's preferences and no doubt the State Department's preferences. And Ed touched on this possibility that, in fact, what's driving a bunch of this is the State Department pushing very hard for Australia to do something about this. The word on the street is that when the Labor candidate announced, and the Prime Minister on the campaign trail last year announced that they would bring the port back into Australian hands, the word on the street is that they had gotten wind that the opposition, the Liberals, were intending to make such an announcement within days, and therefore they jumped in ahead of them to cut the Liberals off at the pass. You can imagine behind the scenes how that was being set up. The Liberals, who had become very, very hawkish, would be quite happy to play the national security card and again force the Labor Party to either fold and fall into line, and ultimately that's what the Labor Party did. And now it's got itself caught in a problem that, look, frankly, I don't think has a lot of upsides from Australia's point of view, other than any perceptions that the government has about its relationship with the United States, much of which, incidentally, has gotten rockier over the last 12 months anyway.
Yeah, the question here is, can Washington's pressure on Australia work, actually?
Well, yeah, I think it can.
Right.
And, Australia continues to pay the bills for submarines, for example, when congressional reports, research office reports, service reports consistently show that the submarines will never get built, that American naval admirals giving evidence also confirm that the American shipbuilding or submarine building industry can't build these things, that the UK Parliament has also heard evidence that the UK can't live up to its end of the bargain either. But Australia will continue paying the AUKUS bills. So, Australia does have a track record of wanting to be seen by the United States of being a loyal sub-imperial ally. And this sort of activity, again, despite the fact that there were 3 security reviews, all of which found no issues, the only party that raised security issues was the Obama administration. In that context, you wonder who this is actually in the aid of. And, a cynic would conclude that this was largely being driven by the US administration applying pressure to the Australian government.
Right. And then, Zhou Mi,
I just wanted to kind of add one thing just to sort of sum it up from the probability. So you have 4 real scenarios. You got a negotiated settlement, which is probably the highest, and that would be a way out. The second one would be Landbridge would win on the merits, and the probability would be meaningful for that. The third one is Australia wins on the security exception. That's a possibility, but it's difficult, like we were just unpacking. And then the fourth is sort of a political resolution outside the arbitration. Which one it will be and which one is the fastest, and what's happening behind the scenes, I guess, is the question. The only thing we know right now is they're on the track for the arbitration. That's for sure.
Which one do you incline?
Well, I think it's going to be a negotiated settlement myself. Okay. I think that's the way that those things, that's the highest probability. I mean, both governments would prefer to avoid a binding public ruling that humiliates one side or the other. I mean, Landbridge, they filed, this creates leverage, and this would be then a trigger to do back-channel diplomatic engagement between parties, and they would come up with something. The template was Germany versus Vattenfall, which is like a euro $1.4 billion settlement on nuclear plants that closed. It was between Germany and Sweden. So there is some precedent for it where they do back-channel, and then they decide not to go forward with this. But that would be my take on it, to try to give everyone face. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things that are going on, but to dig in and stay in the arbitration, they might do that because there are things we cannot see as regular folks, even trying to be experts between governments and between political parties within their own government that make these things more opaque.
Right. But maybe Zhou Mi can tell us something that, even experts here cannot explain or cannot see. Zhou Mi, from a Chinese perspective, what's your expectation? Do you see Landbridge may accept what Ed just mentioned, the middle way, the Australian government?
I would say that, there will be many possible options if they are going to reach some this settlement on these problems. If they have to give this port back to the territory of Australia, in that case, maybe they can try to not only about the payment of this investment, but also about the alternative, maybe, some other ports, whether it is possible for Australia to find some not that sensible ports to be rented by the Landbridge, or they can give some kind of other solutions for securing that logistics and the investment. I think that is not just the ideal options, but that maybe can be considered from the both sides if they have to reach that point of dealing with this problem. And also, we have to understand the decision if the Landbridge have to quit from this investment. I don't know whether there will be suitable alternative investors to investing in that port, and also the local businesses and also the local supply chains. Maybe they are not like before. This is really a not so good thing for Australia because the global supply chain is under reconstruction. There are so many new uncertainties with enough new impacts. I don't think that the economies will benefit from that. So practically, if the company have to reach that step, I would say that they may argue for the options investment and not just the bare ports or the place of a very bad conditions. Maybe they have to think about the possible supply chains relating to those ports.
Right.
Yeah, look, the dimensions here in some ways are a bit asymmetric as well. So from the Australian federal government's point of view, the threshold issue here is national security, which is about as significant as you can actually get. And so if the Australian government cannot get the port operations back into Australian hands, it runs the risk of essentially losing an incredible amount of face in the process. Whereas from Landbridge's point of view, even if the arbitration came down in favour of the Australian government, then becomes a question of compensation, right? So it's just a question of money. Whereas the Australian side, it's actually not about money at all. There's something, much more at stake. Which means I think that there is, and this is why I think this move is actually incredibly clever, because instead of enabling the Australian government to exercise compulsory acquisition, a very powerful legal instrument, it has compelled the Australian government to justify its position in an extremely public environment. And part of the problem with having to run a detailed national security case is that you need to actually demonstrate that, what exactly constitutes national security. And I'm not sure that governments will necessarily want to do that. So there is an incredible amount of pressure on, I think, the Australian government ultimately to reach an agreement. Now, that agreement, I think, will ultimately involve Landbridge walking away from the lease, because that's really the only face saver that the Australian government can have. So the real issue is going to be what gets negotiated on the other side. Now, it may be issues related to Landbridge, which it necessarily will be. It may involve alternatives for Landbridge, which aren't directly financial, perhaps. But given that this also impacts bilateral relationships at a macro level, the fact is that Chinese investments in Australia have plummeted over the course of the last 2 years, and part of that has to do with the environment that has emerged, and perhaps there may be some political settlement that will improve the investment environment for Chinese investors, provided that it's not in some of these things that have literally become out of bounds.
We don't know what the outcome would be, but one thing is for sure, that the Chinese side wouldn't want a forced termination of Australia's lease of the Darwin Port, right? And Beijing has warned it would take measures to defend the company's interest if Australia proceeds. Then, Zhou Mi, what kind of responses can we realistically expect?
For both sides of China and Australia, we have some channels or dialogues between our two parts about, the trade and investment issues, and also about the fulfillment of the chapter, the free trade agreements. I think that we will use this mechanism to talk about the possible impact on the bilateral relations, especially economic relations. If it's not workable, I would say that there are several other mechanisms we can try to use, like for some of this supply chain and industrial chain security checked by Chinese government also, and we also have some other kind of issues to protect the benefits of the Chinese companies. I think that is natural for the Chinese government to react according to the requirement of the law, the foreign trade law and other laws. And for these corporations, I think that we can do more to improve the bilateral trust by giving goodness. But if not possible, I think most of these related stakeholders, maybe they will also suffer from these uncertainties and instability. But I don't think that will be a good result for the China side to do that.
All right, before Zhou Mi takes off, one more question for you. If we bring in a comparison, the Panama Port case, I think earlier Ed mentioned this, Chinese firms seem to be responding more proactively in Australia. Why do you think we are seeing that difference in approach?
Well, that is maybe, the nature of the Chinese companies. We are really trying to work hard to reach some kind of mutual benefits by both sides. For Australia, is one of our very important trading partners. If you compare with the trade data, we have actually increased a lot for the past 10 more years. I think that is also, the results after the companies are having more investment in Australia and also trying to improve the infrastructure to support Australia to make its raw materials into the wealth. So the trade benefits both sides, and also the investments are doing even longer term and more sustainable impact on the local community. I think that is the Chinese company, what they're really good at and what they really want to have. So we have seen so many examples. I think it's not just about one company. It's about the understanding, especially after we joined the WTO, we believe that cooperation should be based on the promises. We should not just violate our own promises because of some other country's threat. This is many Chinese companies share the similar philosophy and principles.
All right, thanks for that. I'll let you go. Thank you, Zhou Mi.
Okay, thank you.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Then back to Warwick. China-Australia economic ties have only recently begun to stabilize, after years of tension. Is it worth the risk for Canberra to potentially disrupt that recovery?
Well, my own view is that given that there were 3 reviews that showed that there was no security issues, that pursuing this matter has no justifiable basis. So that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of 3 reviews undertaken by relevant departments and agencies looking into the matter. The fact that the government and the opposition have both come in behind this issue seems to be entirely capricious and political to me. Now, this is unhelpful unless the process of arbitration and the negotiations that I'm sure will take place in and around that process delivers an outcome that, in a sense, everyone can live with, then it does run the risk of souring relationships further on the investment front. What that means on the trade front, time will tell. I don't anticipate in the short term that there would necessarily be any spillover. Okay. Trade is mutually beneficial for Australia and for China, but it does once again sour relationships. Let's face it, trade's actually a pretty easy part of bilateral relations, but it's investment that ultimately determines the extent to which parties intertwine with each other in the long run in ways that are, not as easy to untangle as this particular case proves.
Right. To Ed, from a legal perspective, the key takeaways from the Darwin Port dispute for Chinese companies and perhaps for the policymakers as well.
Yeah, I think, the first is invest where your treaties have teeth. I think that's the lesson to be learned here. Yeah, I think with the Panama situation, there was not a unified front. I know that came up earlier, and their Landbridge is maintaining a unified front with China. And so one is, are these agreements going to hold? This is the lesson for China. Second is is to document your commercial performance as future legal evidence. So Landbridge, like we talked about, they've got 42 million Australian EBITDA, and it's a 25% annual growth. And so they need to document that, why that's good for business and good business metrics. And, as a lawyer, that's what I would tell people to do, same with the Chinese government, so that if this gets taken away, that you got those kind of damages, which appear to be, they would be above $1 billion or more, closer to $2 billion. So every profit report, every capital expenditure record, China needs to keep these notices in case this gets taken away from them. The third thing is, engage with the host government security concerns proactively and don't wait until a divestment notice happens. At least, I think, by making this preemptive, arbitration, that they went ahead and did that. They were seeing that was coming. There was some telegraphing of that. But, commission independent technological or technical security audits should be done, and that should be part of the process. The next thing would be to recognize that this is a systematic and it's not episodic. So, they'd have to figure out what supply chains shoring and deliberate restructuring of global supply chains along geopolitical alliance lines. It's already been underway with semiconductors, rare earths, port logistics. Rare earths is one of the things I would would assume that they're getting from Australia now, they need to look into alternatives at all times. And if you look at, it's not a great example all the time, but certainly Mr. Trump looking at Greenland. So China needs to continue to look for those places if other parties aren't going to cooperate. And then I think the last thing that China has to look is they have to look at state needs to ensure its future trade and investment agreements, include the kind of international standards to be able to be met. And so, I mean, obviously China is doing that full time. They don't need any advice from outside sources, but sometimes there's a gap that China has when they're negotiating these deals and not keeping kind of their peripheral vision that these things might cave in. I mean, I don't know what I say with my clients, which is not at this level, of course, but is that you got to hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and you've got to have a backup or a second plan if things change. And this changed in a relatively quick period of time. It's 10 years, of course, but what's the backup and was that ready to be put in place? So time will tell.
Right. You mentioned it's likely that Australia still move to reclaim the port, even if the ruling ultimately favors Landbridge, right? It's just a compensation. So what would be the amount then in that case?
Well, yeah, if you look at the numbers, so you got 89 years left on the lease, you've got 42 million that they're showing in profits, earnings right now. So then you extrapolate that out over the course of time, and you say it's increasing by some 25%. Again, these are not my numbers; these are numbers that I've got elsewhere, but the number could be very substantial. And going to the point that was brought up before, I mean, this lands perhaps on the territory, partially on the federal government of Australia, but certainly it's going to be something that the taxpayers, unless they can find a private buyer, is going to have to swallow. I mean, this penalty or this national security or this breaking of the contract. And the question is whether that's going to be something that the taxpayer wants to be involved in. I mean, when you look at it as a purely financial thing from a taxpayer perspective from Australia, it's actually making money, and it looks like it would continue to make money. So that would be a net benefit to the taxpayer, and then kind of negative for the political, the ruling party or parties, in the future. That wouldn't be positive for them. So those are kind of things that they have to consider. I think no one's talked about that. I'm talking about the actual taxpayer itself, which might have to eat the price tag of payout if they did this. I mean, as was pointed out, certainly by Warwick, is that they will continue on until there's some kind of a result. So that would be the case. I don't see that they would come in and seize that. It's possible, but unlikely, while this arbitration process is in place. And I think while the arbitration process is in place, and there's also a couple of other fallbacks, under the China-Australia agreement between the two countries, although that wasn't completely formed, ironed out, if you will, from a dispute resolution perspective, that could come into play. And there, might be some sort of white knight that would want to participate in that would change the dynamics completely. So we're dealing with a lot of hypotheticals, but I think that it's not a good sign when people aren't playing by the rules that they set. That's what I think is difficult. And I think it just sends a bad signal to China. It sends a bad signal to Australia. It's not going to help investment in either place. And worldwide, I mean, why do we have these agreements if they're not used indiscriminately? So.
But under huge political pressure, things usually, or sometimes I should say, are distorted. And Warwick, let's zoom out for now. As global supply chains are being reshaped, could cases like this evolve from isolated disputes into something more systemic, signaling a broader trend of infrastructure becoming politicized?
Well, that's the risk, isn't it? And weaponization of foundational infrastructure, in this case, maritime transport-related infrastructure, would cause untold disruptions to global commerce. Is that in the interests of most countries involved? Probably not, actually. If you look at this issue of national security, it's actually only coming from the Five Eyes, from the United States. Let's call it the political West. It's paranoia in Europe, vis-a-vis Huawei, for example, and a whole bunch of Dunroe Doctrine ambitions from the United States in relation to the Western Hemisphere and, of course, Australia here. I don't see other parts of the world necessarily being as animated about this issue as the political West is. The infrastructure investments that have been made mainly by China or Chinese companies throughout the global south have delivered important benefits to countries, and those countries have negligible reasons to have these national security concerns drive their politics. I think what this points to is a global bifurcation where the political West, which has dominated the globe for the best part of 5 centuries, sees itself in essence on the back foot now and is working overtime to stave off the evolution of the global system in a direction where the political West is no longer the economic hegemon. So anything that the United States touches or has the capacity to influence, I think, is likely to be exposed to these kinds of risks, because ultimately this is going to be, well, in part, it's going to be a political battle across the globe.
Then how should Chinese firms adapt if that's the direction we're heading?
Well, in a broad sense, you've got sort of 2 worlds, don't you? You've got a world where political Western sensibilities will be heightened. So the first issue is to try to calm those sensibilities down. Then you've got the global South world, which of course will be subject to incredible pressures, and those pressures will vary depending on exposures to, for example, US dollar denominated debts, etc. And companies and governments are going to need to work overtime to make sure that the diplomatic relationships that they have are solid, and that the extent to which the political West can influence the bilateral relationships between China and these other countries is controlled. That's a difficult thing, but it's doable. We know that the political West has, over many, many decades, been able to exercise influence in all sorts of countries. It does that through actually not the network of military bases, but it's the network of the CIA and associated apparatuses across the globe, and through the control of information systems. Regime change operations, domestic disruptions, and in fact even going dirty with things like assassinations and kidnappings are risks that are rising in the world, and ironically they're not rising from so-called the rogues that the West used to accuse others of being, but in fact it's the West itself that's becoming the rogue.
We don't want to see that. And last bit from Ed, please. Your legal advice for not just Chinese firms, maybe all companies that could face this kind of a situation when things are getting worse.
I think you got to be bold. I think you got to be innovative. Stuff changes. I don't think people should be afraid. And this is not a good situation or good outcome, but I think it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. This too shall pass. I think that things will get positive. This has been a rough patch, but I don't think that people should become insular. And this was said. The ambassador said that they are going to protect. They have an obligation to follow through with this and with helping out with Landbridge. And so you can't just fold, I think is the way to do it. And you can't be afraid just because this has happened in certain instances that it's going to happen again. Otherwise, then why do you have a country and a foreign policy, and why do you have plans for businesses to be able to operate worldwide? As Warwick said, this is all reciprocal. If things go bad for Chinese companies in Australia, then it could also be the same for Australian companies or the Five Eyes companies inside of China. So, there's always this give and take. But I think, as a business person, I think people have to think not just in a micro issue, but in a macro issue and carry on. It very well could turn out probably, that Landbridge could win this case, that Australia might lose this case, that there are elements within Australia that might say that this should carry on and it shouldn't be national security and to divest or do whatever. So I think, it's too early to say what to do, but I think one has to have as a business person or as a country their own plan and not be affected to be reactive to what other people are trying to do to you. You just have to readjust that plan to have some other pathway forward.
We'll have to wait and see how this may pan out. But one thing is for sure, we don't want to live in a tit-for-tat world. And on that note, we conclude our chat for this session. Many thanks to Dr. Edward Lehman of the law firm Lehman, Lee & Chu, Dr. Warwick Powell from Australia's Queensland University of Technology, and Dr. Zhou Mi from the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. We'd love to know what you think. Drop us a line at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tu Yun. Join us for more chat at the Chat Lounge next week. Till then, take care.
Tales of Chinese Children is a collection of fairy tales and fables written by Edith Eaton one of the first Asian American women writers from the turn of the 20th century. Edith focused on children who were treasured.
They are the sweetest gift of all.
Lost.
Get away from me! Get away from me!
Or misunderstood.
My son, the evil spirit in your sister had almost lost you to me.
In the complicated adult world and much more. Search for Books and Beyond on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms to delve into an audio journey which allows the sound to linger around and above you for stunning realism.